Um, yeah, so my name is Michael Johnson, and I'm actually the third generation head chef and general manager at the Pheasant on South Main here in Brookings. The restaurant's been there since 1949, and my grandparents bought it in 1966. They had kind of an interesting history getting into the food business. My grandmother's still the owner. My grandfather passed away a couple of years ago, but he was working at the John Morrell plant, which was then in Madison, South Dakota. And all the guys really missed home-cooked meals and were sick of eating out of lunch boxes and paper bags. So she started running a restaurant out of her home. She was always known as a very good cook and came from a family with lots of culinary skill. And so she basically opened a restaurant in her home kitchen and would cook for the guys on their lunch break. So he would go to work and tell them what was for lunch, and then he would call back and probably on the party line and tell her how many guys to expect. And then she was actually from Chicago, married my poor Norwegian farm boy grandfather from the Madison area. And she was talking about pizza one day and was shocked to hear that neither he nor his family or anybody around that area had ever heard of or tried pizza. So she went home on a visit on the train to Chicago, and she brought back, all of the herbs and spices and ingredients and the cheeses needed for pizza, and made it for his family. And they all burnt themselves on the sauce and molten cheese and said, "This will never take off around here. Nobody in this part of the country is ever going to eat this crap." And she much later proved him wrong. We kind of call her the patron saint of pizza around here. But she convinced him that there had to have been students at General Beadle College, which the college in Madison was known as then. There had to be students and faculty from other parts of the country that were missing pizza, that knew about pizza. So one day, he came home and said, "Oh, I bought you a restaurant. I bought you a pizza place." And so they bought a place and served pizza, but they had to actually come up with a gimmick to get people in the door who didn't know what pizza was. And so they came up with what they called the General Beadle Special. And it was a pizza with bugs on it, edible bugs. And once that hit the press, it was on the AP. There were articles all over the world. And, they finally got people coming in. And they bought the Pheasant at the same time. And they were driving back and forth an hour between two towns, trying to run two restaurants, when they finally just gave up on the pizza den in Madison. And they've been at the Pheasant ever since. I took over about 15 years ago, and so I'm a Norwegian American, half on both sides. So I did grow up with a lot of Norwegian foods, especially at holiday times, and a lot of them have actually become new to me out of my interest since I have become a professional chef. And my grandfather, basically from his deathbed, sent me to Norway, asking me to connect with family, find out more about our history, learn about food, meet some chefs, and get in some kitchens where his commission. So I went, and it was an amazing experience. I've actually done Ollie classes and pub talks, just talking about everything that happened and all the connections that happened on this trip. I was fortunate to meet several chefs from Michelin star restaurants, including Christer Rodseth, who was then a two-time Culinary Olympics champion. And now he has a third Culinary Olympics honor because he coached the youth chefs, and they won at this last Culinary Olympics. And actually, because of a strange connection, I was in his restaurant sitting next to two guys. I apologized. I'm sorry. I know this is annoying. I'm taking pictures of all my food, but my grandfather sent me here, and I promised him I would let him know about everything I ate. And they said, "Don't worry about it. We actually, I am the creator and producer of a food show." And I said, "Oh, well, what show is that?" And he said, "Oh, you probably never heard of it. It's called New Scandinavian Cooking." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's one of my favorite PBS shows." And because of that, Christer, the chef, met these guys, and he filmed the current season, which I think is yet to be released in the US just because of this one strange connection. But I was on ancestral family farms. I ate at every restaurant I could that had either contemporary Scandinavian food or traditional. I actually went to Trondheim mainly because I wanted to see the Nidaros Cathedral, but also because there was one little traditional restaurant in a 500-year-old house that I really wanted to try. So anyway, that's kind of how this pheasant and Norwegian and Brookings thing all kind of fits together here. So this is kind of an involved recipe for me to just cook the whole thing and show you the entire process. But the first part of it will be very easy for you to do using the recipe that we're going to make available to you. As long as I give you some tidbits and pointers that will be what really make it good and authentic and will be sort of like have the greatest bearing on the quality of your end product. But first of all, you're probably going to notice me talking about some things like saffron and other stuff that Americans don't use very often, or might associate more with like Middle Eastern or Indian cooking. And I always find it interesting that a few years ago, a famous chef and historian in Norway decided he was going to find the oldest recipe that he could find, the oldest Norwegian recipe that he could find. And he found one that was very ancient, and it was a recipe with chicken, with cinnamon and saffron. Saffron, cardamom, chilies, a lot of spices have for a very long time been a part of Scandinavian cooking. So much so that, you know, if you think about these spices being introduced for the first time, likely through trade, the Vikings were trading with people all over, and, you know, other people at sea from the Scandinavian countries. And they've been introduced, you know, by the Portuguese and the Moors, and just sort of different waves of availability of these ingredients, so that they have been a part of Scandinavian cooking culture for a very long time, like 1,000 years. And so people often say like cardamom, saffron, that's so Middle Eastern, that's so Indian. And I'm like, no, that's very Scandinavian. It's actually more Scandinavian than a tomato is Italian or Indian, because they've only been using like tomatoes for maybe 300-ish years. I guess it was probably the 16th century actually, when they were introduced to the tomato, and the Portuguese introduced chilies to India in the 15th century. So these ingredients have a much longer standing in Scandinavian cooking than tomatoes and chilies, you know, spicy spice does in Italian and Indian food. So I always thought that was interesting. And they were very covetous amongst the Norwegians, especially the upper class at the time. Norway had things that the rest of the world wanted. They exported honey, metals, wheat, wool, furs and hides, feathers, falcons, whalebone, walrus ivory, reindeer antler, amber, fish, dried cod, textiles, grain, timber, and handicrafts. So all of these things were going out, but mainly what was coming back in was spices, wines, because these spices and wines don't necessarily grow well or can't be well produced in that climate. And then silk for some of the traditional garments. Some of you might be familiar with bunads, or bunader is the Norwegian plural for that word, B-U-N-A-D. Look it up if you're interested in Norwegian culture. It's so interesting. Each region has a traditional national dress or costume that's signature to their area, and they are very ornate, very expensive. Usually people get them around confirmation time. There are bridal versions and widow's versions and youth versions, and there's a specific jewelry, all sorts of very beautiful details. And then more people might be familiar with this style of a Norwegian sweater, which is also very traditional, and was popularized by famous athletes and skiers actually during Olympics and Winter Olympics. Let's see. A couple other things we want to touch on is, like, you know, I'm guessing a lot of you either are Scandinavian or Norwegian, or have rubbed shoulders in this part of the country with the Scandinavian American subcultural group. And part of my soapbox in a lot of the things I do in the community is that I feel like the groups that are here are so shy about our culture, in that if you go to Chicago, you know when you're in Chinatown, you know where you're in Little Italy, and people are like, hey, look at this, we're in lights, look at our flag, come share our food. And here people go hide in small Lutheran church basements out in the middle of nowhere, amongst themselves because they just don't probably feel like people want to try their lye cured stinky fish or whatever the funky things are. But we do have many things to offer that are approachable. This is one of them. And I feel like we should, bring our culture to light. We have great influences from, Native American culture and cuisine, as well as Scandinavian, German, and in Brookings, we have kind of a unique melting pot because of our university. So we've had, I grew up knowing and being familiar with Indian food my whole life. And so, in the restaurant, we do try to nod to some of those things. We actually have a Nordic waffle brunch on Saturdays and Sundays where we do kind of a Midwest, or I say Scandiota, because we have this sort of like Scandinavian subculture in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, this whole area, so Scandiota. But also, something happened to a lot of ethnic food cultures when people emigrated from or immigrated to the United States, in that a lot of ingredients were not necessarily available or native to the area, or didn't travel well, or the other groups around them didn't use them, so they went into parentheses and became optional. And that's some of these ingredients. Italians, we talk about the Mamma Mia kitchen, which is like they have this rich, beautiful culinary culture, and then there are people who think of Italian as their mom's boiled spaghetti noodles with a simple tomato sauce and ground beef in it, and every form of noodle tomato beef, when there's actually so much more richness to that. I feel the same thing has happened to Scandinavian food culture, because who else was using some of these ingredients? They became difficult to get. We're lucky now we have an Indian store, so that helps. I find myself in there a lot. So when those things got left out for a generation or two, people went through the Depression and things like that, and there was a lot of poor food, survival food, and things became sort of bland. And there's jokes about the stereotypes of Norwegian food being colorless, white, flavorless. But I would say, even if you're going to cook that way, the way they had to for a couple of generations, if you really pay attention to the quality of the ingredients, that'll be a much better representation of what those generations were eating, because the dairy and the butter and the meats and the things we're getting in the supermarket are just not going to be the same as what came right off the farm. I'll have some more pointers on that stuff too. Speaking of some of those flavors that make Scandinavian cooking interesting, things that would be very specific to Norwegian cooking would be foraged herbs. I was on an ancestral family farm with an old man who looked like a 90-year-old me, actually. I was kind of shocked to see each other. Same shoes, same coat, same glasses, almost the same hair. He had less of it. But he took us into the ancient cookhouse that had been restored on this family guard farm. One of the two I visited, which had been in, some line of my family since, they don't even know, they think since at least the Viking era. And he was showing us how to hand forage herbs I had never heard of. He didn't know the translation for, just things that they had learned had flavor that could be put in the food. So foraging is really a prominent part of especially rural Norwegian culture, and actually now part of the high culinary scene too, probably. But so foraged herbs, wild mushrooms, especially chanterelles. I was there during chanterelle season, and they're amazing. Juniper and spruce, saffron, cardamom, cinnamon, nutmeg, and then the most native, which are caraway, thyme, and mustard. Citrus is a very new to Scandinavian cooking because it's just not the right climate. It doesn't really grow there, and it was actually, became more readily available during the lifetime of people who are now living. And that's why it became a common Christmas present in some places in the world, because you'd open your stocking or this gift and you'd smell this fragrant orange, and it was just, so bright and flavorful, something so different about tropical fruits. But lemon goes so well with fish, and Norway produces some of the best fish in the world. So of course now lemon is really a staple in their diet, but very new. Also dill, honey, fennel, licorice, sweet and salty. If you've never experienced salty licorice, try it, you'll be hooked. Parsley, salt and black pepper, juniper berries, all sorts of berries, lingonberries or titterbår, dried ginger, allspice, sweet paprika, smoke, fermentation, pickling. So it is flavorful. There are all of these things that are traditional to the food. We just need to, we're over the Depression. Let's bring them back. Let's put the saffron back in. Let's add the flavor and not just have everything just drowned in plain cream and bad butter.
So Michael, based upon all the ingredients you're talking about, what ones are we looking at tonight?
Okay, so tonight we're going to be cooking Norwegian meatballs with yay toast gravy. And this one features what is known as meat spice. So there is this attitude in Norwegian cooking that's similar to, so in Indian cooking, you hear about a specific masala or blend of spices that would go in a specific curry. In Norwegian cooking, very commonly you'll hear of the mixture of pepper or white pepper, ginger, allspice, and nutmeg. So this is that je ne sais quoi, that something that makes it seem very Scandinavian. You know, it's also very commonly in Swedish meatballs. And then in the side, it's going to be a root veggie mash, which features saffron. And we'll be talking about like how to use saffron. It's interesting to note you can make these meatballs with, you know, many different kinds of ground meat. And this gravy is also similar to what's in a hunter's stew. And when you use game, like reindeer or other, any sort of game, as soon as you add juniper to that meat spice, then you have game spice. So that's sort of the masala that you would use for those. So let's see, I got to check my notes because you'll learn that I bounce around and kind of go all over the place, get on tangents, because it's exciting to me. I'm a food geek and a culture geek. So she told you how you can get the recipe for the meatballs, and I'm going to demonstrate a couple things. We'll talk about some of these specific ingredients and where you can get them. Kirsten's going to jump in and help me here at some point, but first I just wanted to kind of show you one thing that a lot of professional chefs like to do, since we're not going to be going over like every technique you're going to be using throughout this recipe, is chefs really like to show people easy ways to chop an onion, because everybody kind of has a technique. I'm falling apart here. And chopped onion is the beginning of a lot of recipes in a lot of cultures. As soon as you hear and smell that onion hit the pan, you know it's about mealtime and somebody's cooking something good. But some people do this thing where they kind of cut this grid on and then try to hold it together and chop the pieces for dicing. I actually like to cut mine in half. You can leave the heel on one end to help hold it together, or you can just not cut all the way through the heel and sort of cut the fringe, because you know you've already got these layers, which is going to act as a cut that are you know inside of the onion. But then you're going to cut fringes in the crisscross direction. You've got the piece that is slightly uncut on the end, and then you can, you know, choose your thickness or follow your recipe. It'll tell you how coarse it wants to be cut. Sometimes when I prepped it too early, so it's starting to get slimy and all that happens, it's not at room temp. But then the pieces that are left at the end, you just, well, I'm gonna use that piece. You just complete those cuts. And I went kind of slow for you. If I was in my professional kitchen, I'd be whizzing along trying to keep labor time and labor costs down. But so I just wanted to share a technique there. Probably should have used a cutting board. I cut right on her butcher block table. But anyway, so there's one of those fun chefy tricks that you can use at home. We also, with this recipe, I didn't want to do something where you have to have all sorts of specialized equipment. That can be true for a lot of Scandinavian cooking. There's like, you know, the lefse stick and griddle and the krumkaka iron and the goro iron, and there's just so many specialized things. And, you know, I didn't want to present something that you wouldn't be able to cook without spending hundreds of dollars on the rest of that. But so I'm actually going to demonstrate, of course, I used the TV trick and I have some prepared, but we're going to show you some of the stages along the way here. Kirsten actually won't need any more than that because we're going to do such a small batch, but we will have you help me when we get to the
we do have a quick question from the chat.
Yep.
And it asks if you can substitute something if you can't find saffron. Like, can you substitute turmeric, or if you can't find those special ingredients?
I mean, you could. However, saffron is really the king of spices. It's the most expensive spice in the world, and that's for a reason. It's the individual crocus, I think, or stigma of a flower, and there's one in each flower, and they're hand harvested. There's lots of imitation or poor quality saffrons. Most comes from Iran, but there is some produced in Spain. You could leave it out, but it's really kind of a special spice. And I would say, always use good quality spices. Grocery store spices staying around for a long time, especially like where the heat rises from your stove, are going to be so flavorless compared to good quality spices. Do you carry any spices here? So if you can find a good local spice shop, if you're in Brookings, definitely try Flavor. There's also a site online called Spice Jungle where you can order really great spices, and there are some others too. Just Google around and look at reviews and look for comments from professional chefs saying that they use them or that they like them, or many good home cooks too. But I would say I'm not sure exactly what you would use in this specific recipe to substitute the saffron. Trying to do it would give it a similar color. It's not quite as flavorful. If you haven't worked with saffron before, it has such a unique, rich, regal flavor, but it's understated if used right. And it's if you don't know what it smells and tastes like, it's very. I always think it's kind of a little bit smoky, a little bit floral. It reminds me a little bit of like expensive leather and flowers at the same time. It's kind of hard to describe. And it's used very often in Christmas time baking. The reason a lot of these recipes and things survived is because it's Christmas. They were going to splurge. Christmas has been such a huge deal to the Scandinavians, like a 3 days to a week of celebration. She's going to show you one little capsule. This is not the saffron I normally use. I took a gamble and had to get it at the grocery store because I didn't have time to go to Flavor while they were open. But actually, if you ask him for it, he keeps it under the counter. It's kind of, I don't know, it's just one of those things that you actually can make we're making the Norwegian meatballs with yay toast gravy, and then we're going to make the saffron veggie mash, and the vegetable mash is good even without the saffron. I was just doing that because we just really wanted a full, interesting experience here. But let's see, where are we? So we're going to talk about a few important things. Kristen, do you have like a good skillet for browning? Since I'm doing a partial batch, I'm going to use a smaller pan. If you're doing this at home, Scandinavian meatballs are typically smaller than like Italian meatballs, which, I mean, sometimes I've seen Italian meatballs that's like one huge meatball on the plate or shared with a family. You'll hear people say like teaspoon size even, which I think is a little small. But in that case, I would use a bigger one, especially if you're going to build your sauce in the pan afterwards. And we can talk about the pros and cons of doing that. I'm going to demonstrate with a much smaller batch, so I can use this smaller frying pan. At home, you might want to use several or a very large one. So the first thing we're going to do, can you switch back down here? So I have ground lamb and ground beef in this instance. Most traditionally, it would be ground lamb and veal, and they become so tender, especially when you add some bread that has been soaked in yogurt and milk. You whisk the yogurt and milk together, and then you soak the bread. I should have taken the crust off, but I knew that this is made by Sam at Coddleston here in Brookings, and so it's a little sturdier than most white bread you would use. If you have to substitute an ingredient here, that's fine. If what you have is sourdough or some other bread like that, use it. However, you're not going to want to use a real grainy bread. You're going to want to use a more like incorporated bread, that's very soft, because the whole point here is the tenderness. When you're making a full-size batch, it makes like 8 portions. You would use 4 slices of white bread that get soaked in this milk and cream to 2 pounds of meat. The recipe here says to use 1 pound of ground lamb and then 1 pound of either ground pork or ground veal or ground beef. The Norwegian word for this is actually not meatballs, it's meat cakes. It just translates funny. It's kjøttkaker. And it's because when they are that tender and when you're browning, it's almost hard to keep them in a ball. And so you'll even see sometimes that it's so tender and there's so much milk-soaked bread that it just kind of plops, like almost looks liquidy in form when it hits the pan. So it's more of like a cake shape. We did get some pretty round meatballs. If you want that, then take it directly from the fridge, because if you have the fat starting to get warm and you're adding the bread and the egg and all of that, then that's when you're really going to have a hard time keeping that shape. I'm going to discard my crust here. Another important thing here is, so she showed you that milk-soaked bread. I'm going to make sure that that is as mixed up as possible. As a little prep here, we are going to brown a little onion. I'm sorry, I'm used to working on gas everywhere, at home and at work, and so I'm trying to learn the number settings for her electric stove, and I just have to ask her all the time. What did you tell me would be good for browning?
Like 6.
6 for browning onions too, like
I do
lower, like 4.5, 4.
Yeah.
So the first step is going to be, now I got to guess how much onion that would be. This recipe for 8 servings calls for 3/4 cup of milk, 1 medium onion finely chopped, 1 teaspoon of Nordic or Greek style yogurt. It's kind of hard to find Nordic yogurt except for a brand called Siggi's, S-I-G-G-I, which is Icelandic skyr. But you could use just about any yogurt for this. 4 slices of white bread, crust removed, 1 teaspoon of good quality olive oil or vegetable oil. The reason I say good quality olive oil is because if you use like cheap, bad store-bought olive oil, it doesn't have very much heat resistance. If you want to learn more about that, Kirsten actually sells some olive oil from Coteau Prairie, and we do it at the Pheasant also. Trevor, our assistant at the restaurant, he actually did a talk on YouTube called Eat Olive Oil, Not Lamp Oil, and it's from a TEDx talk, and it kind of explains olive oil as an ingredient. It seems very not Scandinavian, and it is pretty new to Scandinavian culture, but they use a lot of olive oil. There's kind of this balance of healthy and indulgent things going on with Scandinavian culture, so when they are eating healthy, they do use a lot of olive oil. And of course, there's the meat spice, which is a tablespoon of ground allspice, a teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg, a half a teaspoon of ground ginger, 1 pound of ground lamb, and then 1 pound of ground beef, pork, or veal, 1 large egg yolk, 1 tablespoon of kosher salt, 1 tablespoon of freshly ground pepper, and then more salt and pepper to taste. So then the first step will be to brown the onions and then add the meat spice to the onions, and then we're going to incorporate those. We are going to want to not overmix these because we don't want to pack them. We want to maintain that tenderness. Yeah, I get so like muscle memory intuitive about using my own stuff that I didn't even have the stove on. But we're going to make sure that the bread is totally mixed up and incorporated. And then we're going to try to sprinkle that around as best we can and get the egg to kind of incorporate as much as we can. And the onions kind of sprinkled in without just like dumping it separately and then over mixing it. You don't want to over mix because tenderness is something that makes Norwegian meatballs and Swedish meatballs so much different than a lot of meatballs from a lot of other cultures. So I'm gonna where those onions go. Oh, another note about you kind of have to look at the source of a recipe because, you know, of course, there are a lot of people in the United States cooking French and Italian and Norwegian and Indian foods. But some of those recipes are written by chefs in those countries. A lot of times they'll be by weight. And if it calls for something like 1 large onion, they do not mean an American. American produce sometimes is so much different in size and larger. I don't know if it's fertilization or just because they're trying to, you know, we eat larger portions, they're breeding things to be larger. But if for example, I was looking at some recipes for Norwegian meatballs, and most of them called for an onion or a medium-sized onion. And if there was a picture or a video or anything, that onion was what we would call a small onion. So this calls for a full one for 2 pounds of meat. I have about a third batch here. It was a large onion. So I think that's probably that. We'll see how hot we are here. Still waiting on that to heat up. So the onion I did chop pretty finely. You're not going to want huge chunks because the meatballs are going to be small. Then also when we cook these, we are just going to kind of sweat these onions and get them to be translucent and soft and tender and cook down. As soon as they start to get brown or crispy, that we don't want that, because that will really interrupt the texture, and it'll also make the onions harder to fall apart. We want them when they're in that sort of like soft translucent stage. It's not ready. Does anybody have any questions while we just wait on heat? Logistics here. We're good.
What is the, is it Maillard reaction?
So we are going to talk about browning the meatballs, and that's when the word Maillard will be really important. It's M-A-I-L-L-A-R-D. It's a French word, probably named after some chefy scientist or something. I'm not exactly sure. But that will be very important to this recipe. Looks like we're at a good heat now. Are all these heat safe? Silicone person? Are all these heat safe?
Yeah.
What do you recommend as a tool for browning onions?
I probably brought it home.
Old fashioned, use a wooden spoon. Just want to keep it moving. Things oiled here. I guess there are some kind of bigger chunks in here. I was talking and chopping at the same time.
We have a question about the browned onions. Do you recommend letting them cool before you add them to the meat, or does that matter?
I haven't really noticed that it matters. However, I think, let me think. When I'm making a full batch, naturally as part of the process, those onions might end up with a little time to cool off. Let me see if I noted anything about it. I usually kind of just go on autopilot, so it's now I have to stop and think.
I'll say there's nothing specific in the
No, I really don't think that probably makes too much of a difference.
While you're browning onions, we did have a question about if this is ever on the menu at the Pheasant. I know you and I have talked about this.
Okay, so the reason I am giving away one of my recipes is because we have done this as a weekend special, and we have done this for local culinary showcases and local culinary competitions, and people love it. People who have never tried it, kids love it, picky kids love it. Just serve it to them. Don't tell them what's in it until they tell you they love it, and then say, "Oh, looks like you like lamb. Looks like you like saffron. Looks like you like." But the reason I'm giving it away is because I don't ever want to have to do it in large quantities again, because of the labor associated with. So this batch of like eight-ish servings, or I would say 5 to 6 if you got a couple big eaters with maybe a little leftovers. you have to ball up 75 to 80 meatballs. You know, the process is kind of involved, and then it doesn't hold well. So, for example, the meatballs are so tender that we were at a competition where we were serving 200 people samples of meatballs, and by the end, I couldn't even fish meatballs out of there. It had kind of just gotten, the meat had incorporated and gotten so soft that it's just, this is very much a home dish. You could do a version of this with just like, you know, a meatball that didn't have quite that tenderness and stuff, and you would get all the flavor, but it would just be kind of a different experience, I think. Like, for example, IKEA's Swedish meatballs, you know, they had to develop something that holds well and that they can serve all day on the fly. And so those meatballs are not quite as tender as, you know, a lot of people who make authentic Swedish meatballs. Most of us are most familiar with Norwegian, what we called Norwegian or Swedish meatballs, that were kind of a Midwest Better Homes cookbook version, which is like maybe some nutmeg and allspice in the meatballs, and then like a sour cream and cream of mushroom gravy, and people doctored it up in all sorts of ways. So now we're getting translucent, and because I'm starting to notice a little brown, I'm pulling off the heat here a little bit and getting ready to add the spices. I have my portions mixed down. I probably should have put just a tiny bit more onions than I did. Actually, maybe that's all right. And so this is where I'm going to put in these spices, and it seems like a lot. Especially when you're doing a full batch, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm just dumping so much spice into this recipe. But this is really what makes it.
Which of the spices did you put in there just now?
So this is the meat spice that we talked about. So this, I had them mixed in one bowl, and it's the ground ginger, grated nutmeg, allspice, and that spice mix normally would have pepper in it, but we're gonna add pepper here. These are the very fragrant spices, and we're just gonna make sure these get kind of coated and incorporated. I started with quite a bit of oil, but there actually is a little bit of moisture and fat in an onion that kind of comes out, and so we end up with this kind of coating here. Kristen, are these silicone scrapers and spatulas heat safe?
Yep.
So you're gonna wanna do what you can to get, every bit of this into the meat. So now that I'm doing it, I see like, nope, I guess I don't let them cool off at all. So in here right now, I have the two kinds of ground meat already. There's an egg yolk in there, which I don't want to fumble around cracking eggs and get shell in there or something. Well, so you've got kind of like a loose mix here. And then we're gonna add these onions. And someone have gloves. So if you're at home, you can use your bare hands to do this. And for some people, that's part of the fun. I just have a hard time after being in a restaurant kitchen. So I'm just kind of loosely tossing around and kind of incorporating those onions. Oops. And then in goes the bread. So I put the yogurt in with the milk, and actually, because with a small batch, I shook it up just in a little glass jar with a lid on it. But you could also kind of like, you know, whisk it or whatever, just to get that incorporated, so you don't end up with yogurt chunks. And then we're going to kind of sprinkle that around, and we're just doing what we can to make sure that that bread gets incorporated, because part of what the bread is going to do is it's going to trap some of the flavor and the fat from the meatballs. Another really common way to make Norwegian meatballs is using potato starch, and I think those are just as good, but I really like what the bread does. And some people actually soak their bread in heavy cream, This bread is a little more sturdy than most white bread, and I think I tried it once and it just didn't really soak in. But you want to make sure that we're well incorporated here, without pressure. I'm not mashing anything together. I'm just getting things as well incorporated as I can. And then if I see any big white chunks, that's going to be one chunk of bread saturated in meat, fat, and dairy. So we want to get that kind of mixed around. Where do I find just like a plate? Yeah. Okay. So you could use like a baller like this, like a scoop, or a melon baller if you want to maintain your size. Let's see, did I leave anything out? Do I got everything in here? I need to follow my recipe to make sure I don't space off the step.
Got it all.
So when you make these, this is where, so I'm a recovering perfectionist. This is where people just really want to ball this up and pack it down. And we don't want to do that. We want an imperfect little form. This might be a little larger than I would a lot of times do them, but because of some of the troubleshooting problems that could happen with getting it on camera, I'm going to make them just a little bit bigger. We'll just make a few here because I have a pre-made batch. You see, I'm not really packing. I'm going for imperfect. I was telling them that I have kind of a mantra when I go into perfection mode, and it's lyrics from a Leonard Cohen song. I have them here somewhere, actually. So you'll have to remind yourself this while you're trying to ball your meatballs too perfectly. Where's that? I'm missing a whole page of notes, I think. I'm getting meat all over my notes. Oh, and here's another. So the Japanese have a word wabi-sabi, and it means the perfection of the imperfect. And so it's like letting things be what they are. Let meat be what it is. Let pottery be what it is. Architecture, furniture made out of how the tree naturally grew. And this really resonates with some parts of Norwegian culture in that, you know, there's some beauty in that. The mantra I was looking for is, from that Leonard Cohen song, is ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So that's my little song in my head while I'm passing the time balling up 75 to 80 meatballs. Anyway, so you get the idea there. And so now, I could use that pan, I guess. It doesn't have to be really faint, just mostly the water up so we don't spatter with oil. So now we're going to talk about that word Maillard. Going longer on the meatballs than I thought it would, so I'll speed this up and then we'll get to the. So since you likely, so there's a concept in, did we talk about koshelig, huga, and mis? So there are these three words. In Norwegian it's kosh or koshelig, in Danish it's huga, and in Swedish it's misi. And they're all similar concepts about a way of life. And so, you know, here we have everything set and ready and waiting for the doorbell to ring. And in Norway, very often somebody might invite you over and they're still cooking when you get there, or they might invite you to be part of the process. And so this is part of the coziness, the conviviality, the togetherness. The Norwegians rank among the happiest people in the world when surveyed very often. And that's in contrast to the fact that the further you go from the equator, the higher your chances of schizophrenia and other mental health disorders. And that is likely to do with their approach to life, this sort of huga koshelig be comfortable, enjoy your meals, enjoy your conversations, instead of pendulum swinging from like a super disciplined, I'm not going to eat anything bad, to like gorging yourself on the worst things in resistance of that, and sort of living in that pendulum. There's this sort of like wholesomeness idea of health and indulgence, self-indulgence a little bit all the time, and just keeping that in balance. And then of course, being outside a lot and staying active. So if you invite people over and you got helpers, just set somebody up with a task, which I'm about to do. I'm about to invite Kirsten into some cushioning here for a minute. But I wanted to demonstrate something on this. This is jumping to the next thing we're going to do, which will be the side for this dish. And while I'm browning, I'm going to have her at work doing this just because I'm watching the time here. But so here for the root veggie mash, you can do kind of any combination of root veggies that you want, usually and most commonly heavy on the rutabaga. A very simple version of this could be made with just rutabaga, potatoes, and carrots with just cream, butter, salt, and pepper. Or you can also add parsnips, turnips, and sweet potatoes. So we have rutabaga, potato, carrot, parsnip, sweet potato, and rutabaga. And you're going to want to try to get somewhat of consistency with these ingredients. So what you do is poke each one and notice how stiff it is. And then put them in descending order of firmness. The rutabaga is going to take the longest. I think then the sweet potato, then the turnip, then the potato, then the carrot, then the parsnip. And the reason we're doing this is because the tougher it is, the smaller the pieces you're going to cut this into, and the tenderer it is, the larger the pieces you're going to cut them into, so that when they boil together, that will help compensate. The smaller pieces will have more exposure to heat, and in the end, you'll end up with something that's fairly consistent. This is also not an incredibly picky step. It's also one of the secrets to some old school Norwegian soups where you don't want to lose the flavor by boiling potatoes, losing the broth, making the creamy base, and then having the chunks left, but to chop tiny, medium, large, and then chunky, so that you will end up with a variation of texture, and the very small ones the starch of those potatoes will completely disintegrate and make the, what would you call it, the thicker part of the soup, and then you still have the texture. So this, I'm gonna let Kirsten do this while I'm over here.
Do we have rutabagas at Hy-Vee?
Yes, I got all of these at the Brookings Hy-Vee. They have rutabagas. Rutabagas come preserved in a thick coat of wax. So make sure you get that off. You can, if you have really good knife skills, do that. Otherwise, a carrot peeler works until you get that all off.
So how big should this be?
So I would do like what you first showed me is good. Yep.
And then these guys just.
And then these guys can be just like a little bit progressively bigger. The one thing about carrots though, carrots, you know how they're kind of fibrous. So those I always kind of cut decently. But hopefully we have a decent thing going on here in our pan. You could use olive oil, you could use butter. Because I have, because I have both, I'm going to use both. And we do this in restaurant kitchens a lot, using part olive oil and part butter, because you get both heat resistance and flavor, as opposed to, you know, one or the other. And then, so here's another thing. If you're doing a smaller batch, what you could do is you could do this in more of like a deeper, taller skillet like this, so that after you brown your meatballs, you have all those good bits, especially if you have like a non-Teflon pan like this, because those bits will be good. You can just kind of deglaze the pan with the sauce and the liquids that are going to go into the gravy, and then build your sauce directly in that pan. The meatballs will have been browned and taken out, and then you're going to, I'm going to show her, she's struggling with the rutabaga. She's got all her body weight trying to get that rutabaga chopped. The other word for a rutabaga is swede. I don't know why. So if you see in a Norwegian or Scandinavian cookbook and it calls for swede.
We're really sad over here with this.
I usually have a bit. Let's see, hold on. No, it's stuck. It's
You
like,
have to show-
what,
show people
what do you call that? The
pictures.
sword and the stone. We have a sword and the stone situation here. Normally, I have like a sturdy surface. She's on like a little folding table, and so she's just trying to use her pressure. But usually, I just like give it a good whack, and then whack on the table one more time. As long as you're not letting your blade get to the.
Oh my gosh. Jesus. That was scary.
Let's get things started.
Thank you.
Remind me, don't let me forget to tell you about this butter, because you will want this butter. First, I have to fumble around because I'm not in my own space here. Oh, too hot. So I saw that my fat in the pan browned right away. You're going to be a little too hot. So this is where the Maillard reaction is really important. Maillard is leaving it alone, letting it stick, feeling almost like it's going to burn a little bit, but then turning it just in time. If your heat is too low, you're going to cook these through too quickly, and they're going to tense up and be tough. I actually thought I made them in too perfect of balls, so I'm going to flatten all over. And then I'm going to leave it alone. I might have put a little bit too much fat in the pan, but I'm going to take it. And I think sometimes when I make these, I put a blob in there. I give it one little press on the side, and then I end up with 3 sides I can brown. This way I could brown 2, I could roll it around, I could brown each side like a patty. But you actually want this to get pretty brown, like almost like a little bit of like char on it. You notice right now they're sticking, and that's good. And as soon as they release, that'll be my indicator that they're browned and ready to turn.
What was the name of the butter that you used again?
So this butter, which we're also going to use in the root veggie mash, is let's see.
I'll flip it. I can flip it.
It's called Røros butter, or Røros butter, and it's actually newly available in the United States. They have it at Look's Meat Market in Sioux Falls, and you can get it at oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Ingebrigtsen's in Minneapolis. You can maybe find it online. It's only available in a few Scandinavian heavy like areas where the Scandinavians are kind of heavy. And it is the most coveted butter in the world. Even the French chefs say it's the best. Some of the Danish chefs right now are really getting a reputation for kind of being the best in the world, and they really like this butter. It makes great everything. This one is unsalted. The salted one, it's the area that it comes from that makes it so good, and the diet and the grass and the breed of cows, and they're who California got the happy cows thing from, because that's been their thing forever and ever. Is that so? You can see some of these are releasing themselves. I should be using them, and I can smell that we're getting a little brown here. I'm just like losing my tools and. Yep. So, and a few of these, I mean, if they get a little dark, that's fine. Some of the recipes actually might be just a tiny bit too high here. Some of these recipes actually say char. They want you to get to the point of charring these meatballs. A couple of these are a little bit dark. Oh yeah, and on the camera they look really good, but that's still fine. It's still gonna be awesome. Much better than one that's not browned enough. And I would recommend whenever you're browning meat, let it get some Maillard on it. Leave it alone a little bit, and just kind of wait for it to stick, and then unstick itself. When you're doing taco meat, chili, any of those, it will definitely give you a better experience. More flavor. And if the heat was too high, we would definitely end up with a char situation, but the meatballs might not stick together. It would burn before the egg and the fat and the bread had a chance to bind. So if you have an electric stove, number 4 is evidently the temperature we need. I'm learning. Let's see, what else do I have? You don't have to do all
Stock
that.
and reducing stock and sauces and stuff like that.
Say that again?
So in regards to like the stock and sauces and adding water, and is that the next step with the gravy then?
Yep. Okay. So what? And I'm not going to go through the process of making this gravy because it's not complicated. It doesn't require a roux or anything like that. I can kind of like read you through it here a little bit. So the directions for the gravy are simply, in a large deep pot, boil the stock. So the ingredients are beef stock, 1/3 of a cup of brandy. It's 1 quart of beef stock, 1/3 of a cup of brandy, 1.5 cups of creme fraiche or sour cream, or you can look up creme fraiche substitute and make your own with like buttermilk and stuff. Mexican table cream actually works too as a good creme fraiche replacement. 3 ounces of Yate toast cheese, or brown cheese, we'll talk about that here in a second, and 1 tablespoon unsweetened dark cocoa powder. This is actually something that became very popular. People were kind of trying it out, and it's due to a chef named, I think, Signe Johansson, who has some cookbooks out. One of them is called Scandalicious. It's amazing, but make sure that you're finding a copy of it that is printed for the US. Otherwise, you will get everything in metric and measurement and weight, as opposed to English measurement. So anyway, we got some good Maillard here, and then I would remove my meat cakes or meatballs here. If you have any obvious burnt part, get rid of that. And then, you know, you can see here, if I was making a small batch like this, I could build my gravy right in here. It's a little bit greasy and oily, so I might drain some of that off. It's mainly the bits that I want in there, more so than all of this used up fat. This is where, if you were going to make, and there are many different kinds of gravy for Norwegian meatballs. We just really wanted to do the Yate toast one because we've seen some connection to it. And so, okay, so Kirsten has our root veggies ready, and we let all our water boil away.
Oh, no.
So let me finish some stuff. We're just going to do little sample sizes to kind of demonstrate this, since we're not going to make you wait for us to boil a whole other pot of water. So make sure there's plenty of root veg in there. So something about this, with the parsnips and the carrots and the rutabaga and these other vegetables in there, really gives it kind of like a freshness that you wouldn't get with just simply the starchiness of a potato. And then also some common sides would be like mushy peas. There's the traditional one, which is using like the dried split peas, or you could do a very fresh green version with just some like frozen or fresh peas in the summer. Right now we're gonna let these boil, and the process for these is pretty easy. You know, the first thing we cooked was very much, you know, following a recipe, kind of learning this technique. This is more what I call heritage cooking, which is a little more learned or intuitive, in that when you're deciding how much root veggies to buy, just consider how many people you have and look at them in your shopping basket. There's not going to be a lot of waste. So however much you see in the raw form is how much you're going to get in the cooked form. And then everything else is kind of to taste, when you get a hang of how to do saffron. And that's probably the only one. You know, you could definitely over salt or over pepper, but we're going to go over the process here a little bit of, sorry, I'm trying not to make this pop off and lose it on the floor. My hands are too big. Then they got fingernails. Oh, there we go. So I have a mortar and pestle here. I actually keep one small one that I pretty much only use for saffron. But what I'm going to do is you can use salt or sugar. I feel like I brought. Do you have any granular salt, like finishing salt? This one is flake salt, so I'm not sure it'll work. You can use salt and or sugar to do this, but what we want to do is we just, let me see if this will work. Yeah, I think it's granular enough to work. I usually use both. I just didn't bring any sugar because there's one more thing to bring. But we're gonna grind this up. If you want it, if you learn that you love saffron, do more. But otherwise, a little can go a long way. What did I do with the rest of that saffron? Sorry, this is not like Food Network. This is the first one of these. I'm the guinea pig, so I'm gonna fumble around in front of you a little bit here. Yeah. So you saw about the quantity that was, which was pretty generous. I'm actually going to use just a little bit more. But so once I get this ground up with the salt and or sugar, then I'm going to put this in a little container, little tiny, I have like a ramekin here, and I'm going to bloom this saffron. And I want to get every last bit of that out of it. So the salt and sugar just kind of help break it up and carry the flavor, give something to dissolve. It'll infuse a little bit. And I'm gonna seal some of this boiling water. And I'm just gonna do enough to submerge it. You'll see it starting to release this sort of rich color. So that's just what's coated, because I can't really tip it enough without spilling it to show you, but you'll see it's really starting to release this color. And it smells so good. And then she does have a microwave. So microwaves are good for a couple things. Let's see, do you have a, oh, let's use this one. So I'm actually going to melt a little of this butter here. So anyway, this butter, can I just put that on top of there? Is that cool? Yeah. This butter, there are many different producers in this area of Norway, but people actually eat it like cheese. Like they will actually take a slice and put that slice cold on a piece of bread, like a sizable slice of it. It's made from cultured cream, and the salted version has sea salt in it. So it's just very interesting. It offers so much flavor. I suggest trying it at least one time in your life. It's not incredibly expensive. Okay, back to the meatballs. So, is my camera back on?
Yes.
This is the pre-made batch that I had in here, and you can see that we finished them in this gravy. In the gravy, we talked about what's in it. I said I would get back to the yay toast. I have two kinds here. This is the most readily available brands of yay toast. The red one is half cow, half goat's milk. The blue one is all goat's milk, but it's actually not technically even a cheese. It is a whey cheese or caramelized whey. So they even in their American marketing to get people to understand what it is, started labeling it creamy caramel cheese.
Where did you get that?
So I got the red one I got at Hy-Vee. The blue one I get through one of my restaurant purveyors, but you can find it or even ask for it sometimes at Hy-Vee. There are enough Norwegians around here that they stock the half cow, half goat version all of the time. There's a famous milkmaid in like the 19th century or something who figured out the process of making these firm blocks of the cheese to make it available in grocery stores. Before that, people were making it on farms and stuff. And they actually found, I took notes on this somewhere. They found pots dating back to 650 BCE, and determined that the ingredients were yay toast. So this is a very beloved cheese. It's sweet and caramely. They basically make a cheese, take out the solids, and then what liquid is left gets cooked down in a process in a copper kettle. The milkmaid that is now famous for making this like so easy to get at the store was named Anne, and she mastered the process for a firm block cheese with her husband. So you just want to boil your root veggies until you get fairly tender texture. There are two different ways to make this, just kind of like there are two different kinds of mashed potatoes, you know, like the French do like a puree, which is a very pureed whipped potato with no lumps in it, or you can get like a really hearty country style chunky peel on mashed potato. Was I saying baked potato?
Use the mash.
Okay. And what's more traditional would be kind of a lumpier textured version. Those rutabagas are already getting tender. The carrots are being a little more resistant. But we're close. And then the process after this is fairly easy. So back to the saffron. So I bloomed that saffron in that boiling water, and now I'm just going to add it in, because we will be adding butter to the recipe, to the root veggies. We're going to use this to carry it. It'll be a way to sort of get it to incorporate. So Ashley and Kirsten, do you two ever cook with saffron?
Unless the recipe really calls for it.
I have this in
So let's see, where are we?
root veggies.
We're just giving those a couple more minutes to get tender, and then we're going to blend those up. In the meantime, I've had some peas back here. I was hoping to keep those kind of fresh and bright and green. That's a little more the modern approach to mashed peas, but I'm just going to one those together. Sort of semi-textured. We'll actually add sugar and stuff to these and a bunch of other crazy things, which I'm not going to do. However, I'm going to add a tiny bit of cream.
And where do the peas go?
They're just going to be another side.
Okay.
This is since it's winter, we're doing everything very stewed and mashy and tender. In the summer, you could, you know, some other common sides are like creamed cabbage and stuff. But in the summer, of course, you could just do whatever fresh veggie as a side. Green. Trying to heat on those for one more. Oh, already. Hold on. I think we're probably pretty close on the veggies here. You just want to be able to hand mash them. The carrots are being the most resistant. Trying to see if I missed any points that I was going to talk about here. So this yay toast, like other good ways to eat it, if you can find a flatbread called kavli, K-A-V-L-I, it's like a very thin, kind of a whole wheat cracker, and then like a thin slice of this, an apple on top of that. That's really great. You can just put it on a cheese board, and people really seem to like it. Kids love this cheese. As I said, it's not like a fancy cave-aged volcanic ash cheese. It's like basically the leftover byproducts of making the fancy cheese cooked down. And we've made yay toast ice cream. Okay, so the umbrella term for this cheese is brunost, which means brown cheese. Yay toast is this specific kind. When I was in Norway, I was on a food tour with a woman whose husband was a chef in Norway. They moved to Norway from Croatia, and she had become like kind of like the local food expert. And we did this food tour and this beer tasting tour. We met these remarkable people who were like hanging out with Obama and the Queen of England. And when we got home, we looked at pictures of this old couple that we met. He was a Jewish rabbi, and here he was really involved with trying to sow seeds of peace between warring religious communities in the world and largely in the Middle East, Jews, Muslims, Christians. And so he had been to lots of very important diplomatic events. Anyway, he didn't mention that when we met him. He was very humble. And we were at it's called Mathallen or Mulholland in Oslo. It's like a food court, but it's like a shopping food court where you can eat, you can shop, beautiful produce. There was lots of coffee. And I got distracted because I'm a cheese freak, having met the cheese expert guy. And they're all off in the middle of a beer tasting, and I had already mixed the first half because of the cheese. And they had a wall of brown cheese of different kinds, even aged ones and stuff. And then I bought so much that I actually had to throw away clothes to fit the cheese in my luggage to get it back, and it all made it back. Carson, how about a colander or strainer? Okay, we're gonna call these good. Pot holder, oven mitt. So we're just gonna strain these. Okay, so I remember where all these tools are I asked for. Back to the meatballs in the sauce. This right here is now mainly marketed as a dough whisk, but actually it's called a Danish whisk. I don't know if you can see how it's like a big, kind of wiry, and it doesn't have this sort of cage. And so like when you end up with curries or meatballs in a sauce that are finished in a sauce, sometimes that sauce will start to separate, and it's difficult to get in there and incorporate that sauce without disrupting, breaking apart your tender paneer or your meatballs or whatever. And so there are versions of this one where you can sort of like get in and around it without everything getting all caught up in there and breaking it up and sort of incorporate your sauce. So if you have a dough whisk, that's a good use for it. Or if you think you'll be making food like this a lot, or if you cook curry a lot, then definitely eat out a Danish whisk. So now I'm just mashing here. I'm going to first get a little more butter going on in here. I should, okay, if this were a restaurant, I'd get in big trouble. Not put cold cream in here unless I'm going to heat it back up, and I will put it on the burner. Just because of temperature concerns with foodborne pathogens. And then now that I've got enough in here to sort of sprinkle around this saffron butter, I'm going to do that. It sort of adds to the color. One more time, I might have let these go just a tiny bit longer. Also the stick blender a little bit. Matter of preference. Oh, carrot chunks are too big, but yes, we're representing the carrot seed. So you want to give me 3 plates? I think we can start. Why don't you give me big ones? I overblended those peas. Actually, I didn't overblend them. I just didn't account for the fact that they were going to be sitting back for so long.
Is this the type of dish where if you cook all these meatballs and you have the gravy separately, you can freeze it for a while?
You could probably, but you would, since you finish the meatballs in the gravy, which you'll see when you get the recipe, until they're fully cooked, you'd have to pull the meatballs out. This is like many things, like chili, like Indian food, because it's got such a complex or a nuanced spice melange in there. It is a great second day food. And I did make these meatballs yesterday, so you guys will be getting the superior version. I'm going to put one of the meatballs just separately so you guys can see what those are like. And we will. Recycling the use of some of these utensils. I don't have a professional dishwasher with a machine here, so. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I didn't salt and pepper the. So you're just going to salt and pepper to taste. Should have done this kind of towards the end of the mashing process. I could just eat this one, or I could also which I'm gonna do. So normally I have all these people around me to hand things to, and people running things off to the dishwasher and cussing me out for making a mess and wiping up after me. I don't have that at home, but
I can cuss at you if you want to.
make me feel right at home. You guys probably don't know how much swearing goes on in a restaurant kitchen, but it's as bad as you can imagine. It's worth it though. It's very rewarding. So that messy one's gonna be mine. So we have the saffron root veggie mash. We create a little ramp so that you can have the experience of eating the meatballs with and without the gravy. And I do have some broken up meatballs in here because we spent so much time holding. The cocoa is probably the thing that you would not find in many of the recipes of this dish, but it is gaining in popularity. Then a very common thing to eat with meat dishes in Norway is lingonberry.
Where can we get lingonberry?
You can get lingonberry preserves. There's actually a Swedish brand that's very popular in the United States, which I can't think of the name of it right now. And it's like by the jellies and jams. It is similar to cranberries. So when people say like, oh, most commonly lingonberries are eaten with meat, people are like, you have a jelly of preserves you eat with meat? Well, think about Thanksgiving turkey and cranberries. So it has something similar that, that reminds a lot of people of cranberries. You'll see in a moment. So we did really end up with a plate of mush here because the peas got a little over. Okay, so you could serve this with a really seedy like Viking bread or lefse, but buttered lefse, or a crisp cracker bread. It does look much better in person than it does on the camera, but as you can see,
My meatballs are rolling off the
is it
plate.
better on my camera, Ashley?
Here, let me pull it over. Oh yeah.
Can't aim. So you can see
There.
how I made sure there was a bite of the root nose without anything, the combination of the two, and then meatballs without the root nose, and then just the side of the peas with the lingonberries, and then I gave them one of the meatballs so they could see what that's like on its own. And I think that our hostesses with the mostesses should come on camera and you should get their authentic reaction. I guess I haven't tasted it. Tasted enough, but.
I know, like,
Oh, it's
oh, I gotta move the camera over. It's probably
No
best to
pressure.
know if you see us.
You'll notice that the veggies are so little chunky, but
kind
that
of too
wasn't any
big.
concern.
That's yummy.
It's a very cozy, homey dish. You guys can add more salt and pepper if you want. It does kind of brighten it up to add a little flake salt and black pepper.
It's so pretty, the red and green and orange and brown. It's so good together.
Delicious. Just what's needed on what, -20 tonight or
Mhm.
whatever it is.
Very delicious.
Well, awesome. This is amazing. So. Any last tidbits you would like to tell people, or
Did I miss anything from the notes I left?
you
up
didn't?
to,
I
or-
did go through those, yeah.
Yeah, I think I told them everything I intended. However, for the person who asked if we serve this at the restaurant, we do the Norwegian hunter stew quite often, which also has a yay toast gravy, and that is wildly popular. At the beginning of the pandemic, when the restaurants were closed down and people were all of a sudden cooking for their entire family 3 meals a day, we did both grocery provisions to help our overburdened grocery store and our local producers by doing grocery bundles. You're gonna have a forever saffron stain on your table.
That's okay.
And then we also did prepared meals that people could come pick up, like we do all the hard work and they'd come pick them up. And the Norwegian hunter stew, we couldn't even keep up. And that one's really fun because you make the gravy and then actually the root veggies are in the stew as well as the meats, and you use like a variety of meats. So you can use like bison and venison and pork and lamb. So each bite is a little bit different. And you also serve that with a dollop of lingonberry and fresh dill. So if you're in town, keep your eye on our usually Facebook page is the best way to be alerted to our specials. And if you're not dining out, we have Zapoya delivery. Anybody got any more questions or?
I'd say we could open it up right now if you have any sort of questions that you wanted to hear at the end. We had someone that asked, can we please get copies of the recipes? And yes, I'm just going to tomorrow, I'll send out the PDF copies of all the recipes as well as a recording of tonight. So that way, if they want to follow along at their own home, they can do that. So we'll send all those out to emails. It will be both up on the Arts Council website if you can't find, if sometime later on you would like to do it and you just can't find that email on the Arts Council, but also on the Carrot Seed blog. We'll have all that information too. So, do we have any other questions? And if you didn't see in the chat, person here at the Carrot Seed does have that specialized whisk here in stock. And I'm sure that if there is something that you need that you're looking for, she can also help you kind of see if she can find those too. I know that like everybody else, your supply chain issues with things, but I also know that most of the time it comes back and you guys are really good about emailing people when it's back in stock.
Yes, we try.
So we have, I think, one immersion blender and I think just a few of those whisks in stock, but they will be restocked if we run out anytime soon.
And the ballers, do you have some of those
Yep,
too?
and the ballers and the pans and the utensils and everything used in it as well.
And even as a professional home chef, I can tell you my home kitchen is pretty much stocked by this store. She has great pans, lots of handy things, and just good quality stuff.
In cobblestone bread, that you talked about earlier, I know it's up in the cabinet at front as
Yep.
well. So,
And then the next class is on February 15th.
right, and Stacy Perry is joining us. So we're gonna move from Norwegian food to baking goods, which is very just in time, right after Valentine's Day.
However, she is a very good Norwegian too.
Oh. But that's about it for us tonight. So I just want a big shout out and thanks to Michael for joining us. And always encourage people to both shop local at Carrot Seed, but also to partake in our local restaurants. They're all amazing and they are doing great things here in Brookings. So we're catching people on camera here eating all this.
I'm used to hiding in the back.
If we have to be on camera eating, we do too.
There you go. But, well, if there's no more questions, we're gonna let you guys enjoy the cold evening. And if you do make the recipes, we would love to see photos of it. We'd love to share it. So
For sure.
it's one of those, and glad to put it up on all of our social medias as a special treat for us.
And we'd like to know, I'm really curious to hear your reaction to tasting it. So make sure we get, one thing that goes really well with Scandinavian meatballs is homemade pickles. And you can make, just look online for recipes of homemade pickles. It just goes well with this dish. We're actually serving those right now as the pickle with our Prairie Cafe burger. It's the Brookings Burger Clash. So if you're looking for a way to eat interestingly and support our local businesses, there are 15 area establishments. We're actually the defending champ. We did the Oofta burger last year. It was actually had a Bruno sauce on it and lingonberries and dill.
What's this year's burger?
This year's the Prairie Cafe burger. So it's like a coffee crusted burger. You can get lamb, beef, or bison. We have a shallot mustard hollandaise, some cottage bacon. We use sturdy post ranch for the lamb, South Dakota bison. We use Dice Brothers for the cottage bacon, which is amazing. It's on a potato bun. But there are establishments in like Volga, and Aurora, and Arlington, and Brookings all competing. So check that out. There's a Facebook page called In and Around Brookings, South Dakota Food and Drink. And realtor Shane Anderson started that page to help our local restaurants at the beginning of the pandemic and the struggles and challenges we've seen since. So we're thankful to him for that. And if you post a picture of any of your burgers from the Burger Clash on that website, he enters you to win a $50 gift certificate to your favorite establishment.
Well, we're too busy like eating dinner here. So, but thanks again for everybody joining us, and we look forward to seeing you guys in February for another Tune In Tuesday and Delish.
I get to be in the audience that time.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.